Deep within Montana's endless wilderness, with a whisper of pines tells forgotten tales, Forest Ranger Mark Stevens thought he'd seen everything the wild had to offer. But one cold autumn morning, a faint cry from the forest would lead him to a discovery that defied every rule of nature. A pregnant grizzly, trapped and dying, her eyes filled with both fear and silent plea. He had only minutes to decide, follow the rules or his heart. What happened that day forged a bond so powerful, it would change both their lives forever. The morning sun broke gently over the Montana wilderness, casting golden light through towering pines. For Mark Stevens, 15 years as a forest ranger had taught him that beauty and danger often shared the same trail. But that day, something felt different. The forest, usually alive with the chatter of birds and rustling leaves, seemed to be holding its breath. As Mark adjusted his gear and started his patrol, a strange sound pierced the quiet, a low, broken cry that didn't belong to any animal he recognized. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the screech of an injured elk. It was something else, something desperate. His instincts kicked in immediately. Easy now, he murmured to himself, moving through the thick brush, every step crunching over frost-tipped leaves. The sound grew louder, ragged, pained, almost human in its sorrow. When he reached a clearing, his heart stopped. Before him yawned an abandoned mining pit, half-collapsed and cloaked in shadow. And at the bottom, struggling to move, was a massive grizzly bear. Her fur, once golden brown, was now matted with mud and streaked with blood. But what made Mark's breath catch wasn't just her injuries. It was her swollen belly. She was pregnant. His mind raced. He knew the protocols: stay back, wait for backup, avoid direct contact with large predators. But training couldn't quiet the voice inside him whispering, "She doesn't have time." Her breaths were shallow, her eyes dimming. Yet behind the fear was something else, a spark of life refusing to give in. Mark grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Stevens. I've got an injured pregnant grizzly trapped near Sector 7. Send veterinary support, urgent." Static answered him. Then a voice crackled through. "Copy that, Stevens. Closest team's 2 hours out." 2 hours. She'd be gone in half that time. He clenched his jaw, scanning the pit's unstable walls. Every instinct screamed at him not to go down there. But another instinct, the one that made him a ranger in the first place, told him he couldn't just stand and watch life fade away. Mark took a deep breath, steadying his shaking hands. He unpacked his rescue gear, tied the first rope to a pine, and whispered, "Hang in there, girl. I'm coming." The forest remained silent, as if watching, waiting for what he'd do next. Mark's heart pounded as he secured the ropes around a sturdy tree, double-checking each knot with trembling fingers. The old mining pit looked unstable, its walls cracked and crumbling, dust trickling down like hourglass sand. One wrong move, and both he and the bear could be buried alive. He loaded a tranquilizer dart into his rifle, a single shot meant for smaller animals, but it was all he had. From the pit's edge, he took aim. The bear's massive head lifted weakly, her dark eyes locked with his. For a fleeting second, the world went silent. It wasn't the look of a beast, it was a mother's plea. Mark exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and watched the dart strike her shoulder. The bear jolted, let out a guttural sound, then slowly began to calm. Her breathing steadied, her body relaxed, still alert but no longer panicking. He gave a moment, then fastened his harness and began his descent. The smell of damp earth hit him as his boots touched the bottom. The air was heavy, filled with tension and fear. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice calm but shaking. He approached slowly, step by step, watching her chest rise and fall. She didn't move, only blinked, heavy-lidded and exhausted. Her injuries were bad, deep cuts along her side, a swollen paw, and mud tangled through her fur. But nothing looked broken. What worried Mark most was dehydration and shock, deadly for a pregnant bear. He took off his canteen, poured water into the cap, and held it out. For a second, she didn't respond. Then, with a trembling snout, she began to drink. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight. That's a good girl. Every moment stretched like eternity. Using the rope harness, he worked quickly, looping it beneath her massive frame. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cold air. His hands ached from gripping the rope, but he didn't stop. Each movement was careful, deliberate, a dance between fear and faith. When he was ready, he climbed back up, attached the pulley system to his truck, and began the lift. The rope strained. The engine roared. Inch by inch, the bear rose, her weight shifting, dirt falling in cascades. Mark's arms burned, his breath ragged. Come on, he shouted through clenched teeth. After what felt like forever, the bear's front paws touched the edge. With one final pull, she was free, lying on solid ground, chest heaving, eyes open. Mark climbed out after her, keeping his distance. The tranquilizer was wearing off. She stirred, then slowly pushed herself up, unsteady but alive. Their eyes met again. That same silent exchange, pure and wordless. Then she did something Mark would never forget. Instead of running in panic, she paused. Just for a heartbeat. She looked at him with something almost human. Recognition. Gratitude. Then, with a powerful push of her legs, she turned and limped back into the trees. Mark stood frozen, breathless, watching the forest swallow her whole. The radio on his shoulder crackled to life. Stevens' backup's 5 minutes out. He let out a weak laugh, shaking his head. "You're late," he whispered. Above him, the wind moved through the pines, quiet, reverent, as if the forest itself had witnessed something sacred. In the days that followed, the forest no longer felt the same. Every patrol Mark took, every rustle of leaves, every distant call of a bird seemed to carry the memory of that morning. The desperate cry, the trembling silence, and the moment a wild creature had looked at him not with rage, but with trust. He couldn't shake her from his thoughts. At night, sitting by the small cabin window with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, he replayed every detail. The sound of her breathing, the dirt crumbling beneath his boots, the way her eyes softened right before she vanished into the trees. He should have waited for backup. He knew that. It was the first thing his supervisor told him the next morning. "Mark, what you did could have gone wrong in 100 ways. You risked your life and the department's reputation." Mark didn't argue. He simply nodded. He'd broken protocol, yes, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Later, in his private journal, the one he'd kept since his rookie days, he wrote, "Sometimes the wild doesn't give you time for rules. Sometimes it gives you a choice, to act or to lose what little good you can still do." His notes grew longer each night. He drew the outline of her shape from memory, sketching the distinct patch of lighter fur near her right shoulder, the one detail that would make her unforgettable. That small mark became his obsession, his proof she wasn't just a dream conjured by adrenaline and guilt. Winter crept across Montana quickly that year. Snow blanketed the ground, silencing the forest under a cold, white hush. Mark's patrol routes became shorter, harder. Yet each day, as he trudged through drifts of snow, he found himself circling back to that same abandoned pit. The place was healing, the edges softened by frost, the scars of collapse slowly fading under new snow. Nature was reclaiming what man had left broken. And every time he stood there, staring into that quiet hollow, he felt the same ache in his chest. He began leaving small offerings near the pit. Honey jars, wild berries, dried fish, careful to hide them beneath fallen logs where no one would notice. It wasn't regulation, and he knew it could cost him his job, but he didn't care. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped she'd find them. He'd scan the area each morning for prints. Most were from deer or raccoons. But one morning, just before dawn, he spotted something that made him freeze. A single bear track half covered in snow, larger than most, and faintly patterned in a way that looked familiar. His pulse quickened. He knelt, brushing snow from the track's edge. "It's you," he whispered, his voice catching in the cold air. "You made it." Days turned into weeks, then months. The forest moved through its quiet rhythm, life continuing in the endless cycle of survival. Mark went back to routine, leading search teams, repairing trails, rescuing lost hikers. But the bear never left his mind. She became more than just a rescue. She was a symbol of instinct, of faith, of the invisible bond between man and wilderness. When spring returned, painting the valleys in soft greens, Mark's hope bloomed again. He checked every report that came through the ranger station, every sighting of a female grizzly in the region. None matched her markings, but that didn't stop him from looking. His colleagues teased him at first. "Still thinking about your bear?" He just smiled. You don't forget eyes like that. But in truth, he was haunted, not by fear, but by unfinished connection. Every time he heard the crunch of leaves or saw movement among the trees, his heart would skip. Part of him believed she was out there, watching. As the months passed, the forest began to whisper her name again. Cameras caught glimpses of bears in his sector, mothers with cubs, wandering males, lone females. Mark studied every photo, zooming in on patches of fur, shapes, walking patterns. Nothing. Still, he felt her presence. One night, while reviewing footage from a motion sensor camera, he caught sight of a fleeting shadow, a large bear moving past the frame, her outline blurred but familiar. The image froze his breath. He couldn't be sure, but something in that silhouette, the slope of her back, the curve of her shoulder, matched what he remembered. He leaned closer to the screen and whispered, "You survived, didn't you?" He sat back, smiling to himself. He didn't need proof. Not really, because deep down he believed the forest never forgets kindness. It returns it quietly when the time is right. As the final snows of spring melted into rushing streams, Mark made one silent promise to the wilderness he'd dedicated his life to. If she ever returns, I'll be here. And somewhere, beyond the trees, perhaps she was listening. 2 years had passed since that morning in the pit. 2 years of snow, storms, and silence. The forest had changed, yet somehow it still felt the same. Pine needles whispered in the wind. The river carried the same rhythm, and every dawn still broke in shades of gold. But for Mark Stevens, time had slowed, stretched, and folded around one single memory. The look in the eyes of the bear he never expected to see again. That morning began like any other. The air was crisp, sunlight dripping between the trees in gentle streaks. It was early summer now, and the Montana wilderness was alive. Birds singing, streams running high, and distant echoes of life waking from hibernation. Mark parked his truck near the old mining pit, now overgrown with ferns and wildflowers. Nature had healed the wound in the earth. The once broken ground was now a quiet meadow. It always felt like sacred ground to him, a reminder of what compassion could create or save. He was making his routine patrol notes when a sudden stillness fell over the forest. The wind stopped. The birds went quiet. Even the rustle of leaves faded. That silence, deep, heavy, and expectant, made him lift his head. Something was there. Mark scanned the tree line. A shape moved in the mist. Large, deliberate, unhurried. His pulse quickened. The world seemed to slow. Then, through the pale morning light, she stepped out. The bear. The same grizzly. Her fur shone rich and golden. Her body powerful, healed. The lighter patch near her right shoulder caught the sunlight, the mark he'd drawn so many times in his journal. His heart slammed against his ribs. "It's you," he whispered, barely breathing. For a moment, he thought it was a dream. But she moved slow, graceful, calm. Every step she took was heavy with memory. She paused halfway across the meadow, lifting her massive head to scent the air. Then her eyes met his. And in that gaze, Mark saw it. Recognition. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. But she wasn't alone. A soft rustle followed, and from behind her came 2 small cubs, tumbling awkwardly from the undergrowth. Their fur was lighter than hers, their movements clumsy but curious. They stayed close, glancing between their mother and the strange human she'd brought them to see. Mark froze. His instincts told him to back away. A mother bear with cubs could turn deadly in seconds. But her posture stayed calm, relaxed. There was no threat in her body language, no growl, no warning huff. Instead, she took a slow step forward. The cubs followed, mimicking her every move. Mark's hands trembled. His training screamed, "Don't move, don't make noise." but his heart was louder. He simply stood still, breathing shallowly, eyes wide with wonder. When she stopped about 30 feet away, she sat back on her haunches, majestic, grounded, and strangely peaceful. The cubs began to explore around her feet, pawing at the grass, swatting at insects, rolling clumsily over one another. For a long time, neither human nor bear moved. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, witnessing a moment beyond understanding. The mother bear's gaze stayed fixed on him. Mark could feel it, that same wordless connection they'd shared 2 years ago in the pit. Only this time, there was no desperation, no pain. There was peace, a silent thank you, spoken without sound. One of the cubs stood upright, wobbling slightly, sniffing the air toward him. The mother made a soft, rumbling sound, not a growl, but a low, gentle call. The cub dropped back down and nestled close to her side. Mark smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "You remember," he whispered. The bear tilted her head slightly, eyes glinting in the sunlight, then looked toward the meadow, toward the pit that had once been her prison. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if she too was remembering. Time melted. Minutes passed like seconds. The forest remained perfectly still, wrapped in a quiet reverence. Then, as gently as she'd come, she rose to her feet. The cubs followed instantly, patting around her legs. She took one last look at Mark, their eyes locking for a final, breathtaking moment of understanding. No fear, no boundaries, just two beings, one human, one wild, sharing gratitude that needed no words. Then, with the ease of something eternal, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs trotting behind her, their tiny paws leaving faint prints in the soft earth. Mark stood there long after they were gone. The world slowly began to breathe again. Birds resumed their songs, the wind returned through the pines, and the forest's rhythm pulsed back to life. But Mark remained rooted in that clearing, his eyes glistening, his heart full. He didn't chase, didn't follow. He didn't need to, because some stories don't need an ending. They just need to be witnessed. When he finally turned back toward his truck, the sunlight broke fully through the trees, bathing the meadow in gold. A breeze moved through, scattering dandelion seeds across the air like tiny blessings. Mark paused, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Take care of them." The forest didn't answer, but somehow he knew it heard. And for the first time in years, Mark Stevens felt complete. In the weeks that followed, Mark found himself drawn back to that same meadow. Each time, the air felt lighter, calmer, as if the forest itself carried the memory of what had happened. He often stood there in silence, listening to the whisper of the pines and the trickle of distant water, half expecting to hear the soft rustle of paws again. But even when he didn't, the peace remained. He began to notice new signs around his patrol routes: overturned logs, foraged berry bushes, faint tracks near the riverbank. The cubs were growing. He could tell by the widening prints, the depth of their steps. It made him smile every time. The forest was alive, and so were they. At the ranger station, stories spread quickly. His colleagues teased him at first, calling him the bear whisperer. But as photos surfaced from nearby cameras showing a mother bear with 2 healthy cubs, the teasing turned to quiet awe. Even the department supervisor who'd once scolded him simply said, "You did good, Stevens." Mark never tried to approach them again. He didn't have to. He understood now that the truest kind of connection didn't come from closeness. It came from respect, from knowing when to step back and let life unfold on its own. Every evening, he wrote in his journal, not reports, not statistics, but reflections. Thoughts about how one act of compassion had rippled through time and life, touching creatures he might never meet again. He realized that saving that bear hadn't just changed her story. It had changed his. Before, he'd seen the wilderness as something to protect. Now he saw it as something that protected him, a vast, breathing reminder of what humanity could be when it chose kindness over fear. Standing at the forest's edge one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark whispered softly, "Thank you." And somewhere, deep in those ancient woods, a mother bear might have lifted her head, sensing the same peace. Because sometimes, The wild doesn't forget. Sometimes it simply waits for you to listen.